Welcome back to another whiteboard chat, and today we're going to talk about exercise selection. So I had another story post for topic requests, and there was some good hormone lab work type of requests again, but I do so many of those that I thought I would do something training related this time. So we're going to talk about exercise selection. And I made this little chart over here. So the chart is just going to essentially be what factors might be considered a little bit more important and which factors might be considered a little bit more of a secondary thought, as in build your foundation and then think about these things, second. Now, that's not to say that certain context is not going to change that depending on the person, but some things are going to be a little bit more of a foundation, and this is just commonly. So again, if your situation's different, you don't have to send me a message and tell me that you disagree, because it's going to vary, right? So, all right. So let's talk about, I made this little list here, mechanics and imbalances. All right, so the reason I put mechanics is versus imbalances because, well, they often get confused. So mechanics would essentially be what is going to suit your personal biomechanics. What's going to suit the way that you move and the way that your levers move, right? The way that your body's built, the way that you move through range of motion, and that's going to kind of determine what feels better for you. Now, that can also get confused with imbalances. Does something not feel right because it doesn't suit your biomechanics, or because you have an imbalance in terms of lack of development or strength in that area? So sometimes you may want to lean towards an exercise that feels good in terms of your mechanics, but also if something doesn't feel good, that doesn't necessarily mean you shouldn't do it. That may mean you have an imbalance there or a weak link in the chain somewhere, and you might need to work on that exercise or work on something supplementary that can make that exercise better or fix that imbalance, right? So, I mean, and there's plenty of examples of this. I mean, essentially any exercise could feel bad, and especially compound exercises that recruit several muscle groups and have their multi-joint movements, right? So you need to make sure that you're looking at it at both mechanics and both imbalances. When you look at a physique, is there a weak area? So exercise, certain exercise feels bad, but this person has a strong imbalance in one of the muscle groups that's required to do this movement. Well, perhaps they need to fix that area, not just ditch the whole exercise, if that makes sense. So again, these two things aren't quite the same. It's important to decipher between the two, because I think someone will just scrap an exercise because it doesn't feel good, when really it's because they have a weak link in the chain somewhere. Right? Okay. That's going to be, well, primary for sure. So we'll just call it, what are we going to call it? I want to abbreviate. So we're going to call it MI, mechanics and imbalances. Psychology. What do you prefer? Now, this is a double-edged sword, because again, what you prefer might not necessarily be what you need to do. You might just prefer something because you are good at it, right? You prefer to do a bench press because your bench press is strong and you get enjoyment out of being strong and doing something that you're good at. Even though you already have good development in that area and you lack in other areas, you still continue to do the bench press because you like it. Okay, well, is that going to make you better? Probably not, after a certain point where you might be slacking on something else that could potentially make you better. So psychology, we'll put that in the middle. We're gonna say it's between the two. We'll put that on the line there. But yeah, I mean, obviously it's important to be able to get amped up and get focused on exercise and have something you can really connect with. But it's also not a good idea to neglect something just because you don't like it, because again, that may be something you need to be doing depending on if there's an imbalance there, right? So ROI, or return on investment. So what kind of exercises give you the biggest ROI? And this is also going to depend on your training program. So if you're doing a lower, like a lower volume program that has less exercises or less sets, working sets within a workout, you need to be probably doing things that have high ROI. Why? Because, well, you only get so many chances. I mean, if you are doing your rest pause sets and you only have one chest exercise in the entire workout, and you pick a band fly or some ridiculous, that's obviously not a good example, but yeah, it's probably not going to give you a very good ROI because it's just not very high loading. Of course, the way the tension is set up in the curve, it's going to may feel difficult. But again, use things that will give you a large return on investment. No junk volume. Don't waste your time doing things that aren't going to give you any returns. The total volume of your program might make this idea change a little bit, but especially for advanced trainees that have. If you watched my video on overreaching and overtraining, I talked about how the window of effectiveness in the space behind that's undertraining and the space beyond that's overtraining, this window in the middle of effectiveness gets smaller and smaller. So we really need exercises that give us high ROI. All right, so I would consider that important. I would say that's probably primary, or we'll call it in the middle, because again, depends on the programming type, overall volume, probably experience of the person, so on and so forth. Leverages kind of goes with mechanics, but also leverages in like angles and things, and this is more of just like a variation within exercises. You can, I use the bench press example. I mean, there's a ton of ways that you can bench press. There's a ton of like different angles. You got benches, you can move them all over the place. You can create different angles that's going to hit the fibers slightly different, but it's also going to put the joint in a slightly different position. They will feel slightly different, better or worse. And also leverages in the sense of working at different angles, some that are more advantageous, some that are disadvantageous. Yeah, there can be instances where it is maybe beneficial to work at a disadvantageous angle because it reduces the weight, potentially puts less load on your joint. Instances where, like, why do you think a lateral raise, right? A lateral shoulder raise, where once your arm gets out to a certain point, it begins to get harder. It's easy right here with a lot of weight. It's a much harder up here. Why? Because, well, you don't have much leverage. The weight is further away from you. That's physics, right? So, things to consider there. Yeah, potentially. I mean, that's going to be kind of secondary, probably, in most cases. So we'll call that L. We'll put that over there. Room for progression. You could maybe kind of lump this in with ROI, but room for progression meaning how much room do you have to improve on this exercise? It's a lot easier to add 2.5 pounds aside on a squat than it is on a lateral raise, right? Or a bicep curl. Why? Because as a percentage, it's a lot smaller, but you do have that room to continue to progress. Why? Because just the leverage, that you have on the exercise, and it being a multi-joint exercise, and anything that's essentially higher in total load, you're going to have more room for progression. All right, so in most cases, unless you're completely just maxed out on an exercise. But yeah, and this is an argument of potentially doing things that you're not that good at, or things that allow for progression over time, even if it's small. So again, this, and this all are kind of linked together. I like, especially on programs that have a large focus on progressive overload, which a lot of them do. You know, progressively overloading is kind of the point in most cases. Outside of certain, we'll say that, you know, for simplicity terms. But yeah, I mean, you want to look at, well, what exercise am I maybe not that good at that I can progress on? And part of that is because, yes, you're getting used to the movement, and it can be kind of a muscle memory thing and a nervous system thing that allows you to move through a range of motion and get used to a certain bar path and this and that. I do understand that, but also some of these exercises do have more room for progression. And I'll, like, especially on a lower volume program or a moderate type volume program where you do have these smaller amount of working sets, I do potentially like to pick exercises that I'm not that good at sometimes, because I know that I can progress on them for a long time. All right, so, yep, room for progression. Potentially important to remember, especially for people that are more advanced, because your room for progression in general is just not that much at that point. So we'll call that RP, maybe? Yeah, RP. We'll put that in the middle. It's gonna look like rest pause, but it's not. But all right, recovery requirements. Yeah, what kind of recovery requirements of the exercise? So, especially from the CNS standpoint, right? Well, that's also going to be something to consider in the total scheme of the program and how it's set up and how much overall work you're doing, how many sets you're doing, and so on. If the exercise has a high recovery demand, you're probably going to do less of it. It's going to cut into your recovery more, or your overall recovery capacity more, right? So squats have a higher recovery requirement than a bicep curl or a tricep extension or a lateral raise, right? So that's something to consider. Yeah, it's going to be really important, because that's going to really go into the whole scheme of how much volume's in the program, what kind of intensity, how are you auto-regulating, what kind of, are you using reps in reserve, are you not, are you, so on and so forth. That's going to be very important. I would consider that probably primary, since that's going to be a huge determining factor in the overall setup of the program, regardless of skill level. So we'll call that RR, R. And then resistance profile. Yeah, we're getting into like some maybe secondary things. I know, I'm not saying resistance profile is not important, because it is. But again, I see so many people talk about resistance profile and exercises and using, accommodating resistance and bands and chains and things like this, and changing the curve of the resistance. And it's like, all right, I understand the point, but you don't train that hard, so maybe work on that first. But I'm not bashing anyone. I'm just saying that, I see that, and it's an overcomplication of something. Now, is resistance profile important for more advanced people? Yeah, potentially it is, especially when we're looking for, as much recruitment as possible throughout the whole resistance curve of an exercise. It's going to make the exercise feel harder. It's probably going to give you a little bit more out of it throughout the whole range of motion, because, we look at resistance curve, we will have points in a resistance profile. We'll have points within the movement that are easier, points that are harder. You can change that curve and you can make it more even or more difficult in certain areas. Does that matter? Yes, it may. But for majority of people, is it overly glorified? It probably is. But again, context, how advanced the person is, what's the overall setup, so on and so forth. So resistance profile, it's definitely going to put that under secondary. We'll call that, we already have an RP. Well, we're going to call this one RFP here. So room for progression. RFP. be, there you go. Recruitment, yeah, overall fiber recruitment. There is literature on this. There are studies and people in a lab hooked up, looking at EMG, looking at recruitment during different exercises, different angles, so on and so forth. Does that matter? Yeah, but I would say just learning overall activation skills and being able to work a muscle through an entire range of motion and activate the muscle and have a good neural connection with the muscle is going to be first and foremost. And if you can do that, I'm not going to let a study's result on recruitment determine which exercise I'm doing over all these other factors. I'm not going to switch from one to the other just because there's more recruitment, because if it fits all the other bills, I'm going to get more out of it. So recruitment, I'm going to call that secondary for sure. We'll just call that R. So many R's. All right. Yeah, so that, again, that's not going to be every factor, but that's going to be a lot of the factors. We're talking about how it relates to the person's mechanics and imbalances, and actually developing a balanced physique and bringing up imbalances. Talking about psychology, return on investment of the exercises, performing them with different leverages and angles, how much room to progress on exercises, what the exercise demands in terms of recovery, resistance profiles, recruitment. So yeah, that really covers all the basics. Kind of see where we might rate them. Again, it does depend on situation. Some more advanced people versus a novice, this might be flipped around a little bit, but you get my point. So next time you're programming for yourself or for a client, or you just want to get better at programming and kind of viewing these things, this might help. So talk to you next time.